So welcome to the living room. We have with us tonight Cherryn Hassan and Bec Hassan. Not Bec Hassan, sorry. Cherryn Hassan and Bec Woonings, because Bec is no longer a
I'm
Hassan.
no longer a Hassan.
Story.
Only in our hearts, not officially anymore.
And so I first met Bec, I want to say 16 years ago or 15 years ago, when I was working for PY. And we were running ministers' family camps, and there were the Hassan kids and a couple of other families that I went, oh, these kids have their heads screwed on right. And I was dating someone who was going into ministry, and I thought, I want to get to know their parents. And then I think the next year I met Cherryn at Spiritual Renewal Group. I was like, excellent. This is someone who I want to watch because her kids seem to have their head screwed on right. So it's lovely to bring Cherryn with all of her experience and wisdom as a ministry wife, and Bec with all of her experience and wisdom as a ministry daughter and almost ministry wife. You're technically a ministry wife when you're in college, to come and interview each other and share with us what they have learned. So I'm going to hand over to you two.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvia. That was very, very kind. We do forget sometimes that people are actually looking at us and thinking about us as we go about doing things. There's a couple of people who may not have tuned in yet who might be tuning in later, but I can see a few people I just wanted to particularly acknowledge tonight. So my other daughter, Stephanie, is with us. She has kept her screen blank, but she's actually sitting in another part of the house and listening. So I particularly wanted to acknowledge Stephanie. And my husband, David, because he has never balked. Well, I'm going to say he's never balked at letting me speak. It must give him cause for concern sometimes, particularly with the things that I agree to do or that I even suggest I do. But he is supportive and open and allows me to take risks, and he takes risks as well. Now I can see Jan Gorton there, and Jan is someone who they came into ministry in Albury as we left to go to college. And Jan has a strong connection to Maruya and actually lives in Maruya now, which is where our first parish was. And Kiralee, I wanted to give a shout out to you as well. I know you've got a blank screen, and that's fine. So Kiralee, like Bec and I, has come from Albury, which is really a rather pleasant place to be, and gone with her husband into Sydney, which we don't find pleasant coming from Albury, to allow her husband to study at college so that they, both Bec and Kiralee, can then go off to be in ministry somewhere else. So I actually understand a little bit of what that's like, of leaving church where we were able to function fairly well as people, as usual church members, and get about doing ministry, and then to have to give that up to go off to let your husband study, and for a fairly unknown future as you get going. So I wanted to acknowledge Kiralee as well. Now Sylvia and Rhonda, and I can see Rhonda's has come to join us. Sylvia and Rhonda have spent many years with me in spiritual renewal groups, so they know me fairly well. And I, as I know them, I particularly wanted to give a shout out to any other student wives who are with us as well. I don't know you all, but I know that some of you have joined us tonight, and Bec and I really hope that this is helpful, particularly for you, and wanted to welcome you in particular tonight, as well as everyone who's joined. And we were praying beforehand with Anna and Sylvia about just our desire that this is helpful, both for people who might be starting out, but also for anyone who may be involved in ministry and reflecting on your own experience and your own ministry opportunities at the moment, as well as what's happened in the past. I think I've covered most people. I know a few of the rest of you, and others I haven't met yet. And a big shout out to the ladies from Cowra I might see you some weekend sometime, because my next port of call is going to be to live in Canberra, which is only a couple of hours away from my two little granddaughters and daughter and son-in-law. So I might be across sometime. You never know. So
I appreciate the priority order there, Cherryn. I appreciate the priority to order. My granddaughter's my daughter.
My granddaughters just need more physical contact than adult children do, who keep in fairly good contact, but they're better with screens. They don't get distracted and run away. And I just wanted to start off tonight by acknowledging that both Bec and I will be just speaking from our own personal perspectives. We're not trying to write the book on ministry wifing for everyone in all contexts everywhere. We're really just talking about ourselves and our own experiences with things. So people who might have known me at other times, I'm just getting rid of something that's popped up on my screen. But people may have other relationships with places that I talk about, or their own experiences that are quite different. And I expect that we all have quite different personalities, and that impacts all kinds of ways that we do ministry and think about things. So Bec and I have some similarities to each other, but we're also not the same as each other. And so there's going to be things that are similar for us, things that are different, even for those of us who've come from the same, the same places in the same times, doesn't mean that we actually have seen things in the same way. Well, to start with, because Rebecca was a child for much of our time in ministry, so I thought I'd just give you a brief rundown of the two places that we have been, so you've got some kind of context of what my perspective is. So when we left college and were appointed by Ministry and Mission, our first place was Maria. It's actually Maria, Churros Head and Narooma, now called Eurobodalla Presbyterian Church or something like that. It's got a slightly different name now, but we basically lived in Maria in a manse. My husband was also responsible for Churros and for Narooma. So what that meant was that on Sunday mornings he would preach at Maria and then fly down to Narooma and do that one, or he would preach at Churros and then go down to Narooma. So the kids and I would generally be at Maria, and our house was at Maria. Now, the situation with that first placement was that it was what I considered a very poorly placed church manse. So for those who don't know that area, there was a single driveway coming up like this, and then there was the house, and then there was the church. So there was no back way to get in and out of the house except down the driveway, which was the same driveway as church. We lived opposite a golf course, but also opposite a primary school. And so my primary school age children would need to walk up and down this driveway to get to school, even though it was close. My concern as a parent was that people from Maria used to find the church car park fairly handy to park in when they were dropping their kids off. And so there would be four-wheel drives and all kinds of other vehicles going up and down our driveway to get a park so they could get their kids to school. And so that was difficult for me. Also because the front of the manse was not fenced. And to start with, when we got there, the back of the manse wasn't fenced either, but we might get to that later. So as a person who actually particularly likes having fairly clear boundaries, physical boundaries, that was tricky. And also that my husband was backwards and forwards with these three churches. And it was very obviously a church manse. So one of my concerns before I got there was that we did not have a letterbox or a street number. So it wasn't considered like a normal house in the street. It was considered part of the church property. And so the only way we could get mail and so on was to come through the church PO box. And so any personal mail to us went to the church PO box, and we would need to go and get it from the from the post office. So after 5 years, in Maria, we then went to Tamworth. Now there's several Presbyterian churches in Tamworth, and my husband was called to Tamworth Community Presbyterian Church, which had been a church plant quite a few decades before and had lived in a number of places but did not have its own church property. And so at the time that we joined was actually back with the parent church in their building, meeting at a different time. During our 11 years in Tamworth, the church moved from being there to being in a school hall. So we saw that as an improvement to sort of differentiate a little bit between the two churches. And we were able to have a manse allowance in that church. And so we had our own property. It's not very far away, 10-minute drive from church, but it was our place. And so we spent our time off. We often did renovations and changed paint colours and all kinds of, I think we changed almost everything in that house. So when we went to Maria, Rebecca was in year 4, is that right? No, year 5.
5.
Yeah. So when we arrived in Maria, Rebecca was in year 5 and we left when she had finished year 9. When we went to Tamworth, she went into year 10 and then after a couple of years went off to uni when she'd finished year 12 and was fairly often back with us because we didn't like her being away so much. So she came and studied in Albury, but we would call her back as often as we could get her to come back so that we could see her again. So by the time we left Tamworth, Rebecca had you just had Lucy, I think, by the time we'd left Tamworth, and Emma was born after we'd moved off elsewhere. All right, so that's a bit of a brief description of where I've been and what that was like. So I'm going to hand over to you, Bec, to have a bit of a chat about what things were like living as a child and a teenager in Maria and Tamworth with your dad as the minister.
So I just want to start off by saying I'm a mum now, but before that, I'm a genuine believer that most parents most of the time do the best they can with the resources that they have, which is true of my parents, and I'm sure is true of all of you who are parents. And sometimes we don't have a lot of resources, and that's okay because we do the best with what we've got at the time. And that doesn't make you a bad parent. And so when I say things, if they sound negative to you, that I have no ill will to my parents. I think they did a great job with the places that they were and the resources that they had available to parent us. And I have very fond and happy memories of my childhood. I think there are lots of drawbacks and hard things to being a minister's kid, but not everything is hard. I have very fond and happy memories of my dad being more flexible than some other dads who worked full time. And he was able to make a priority out of coming to school things and being able to visit. I don't remember him missing important presentation nights or that kind of thing. He made that a priority. And that really helped us, I think, as kids to feel appreciated in that. So when we were in Maria, my family were the kids in the church. My mum was my Sunday school teacher. I've grown up most of my life as a child and a teenager with my father being my Bible study group leader, which is a fairly unique experience compared to other children in churches. And so my parents made a very strong notice at winter camp. I remember when we were in Maria, my parents, for the first few years, would drive me and my sister to Canberra, and then we would go up with the Canberra kids up to winter camp. And my first winter camp, I got to the end of the weekend and I just cried because I didn't think that there were that many kids who went to church. Like, that wasn't my experience. I went to a church where my family were the kids that were there. And so it was really important for my parents, and rightly so, that we actually got to meet other Christian kids. And so I really appreciate the way that they made that a priority. And then after a few years, Mum actually just started getting a job on camp. So she would take us and she would go and do things and be mentor, and because they saw it as important that we got there. The other thing that I found really helpful as a ministry kid was ministers' family camps. If you ever chat to me in real life, I'm a huge advocate of ministers' family camps. Love them. Don't fully understand why people don't come to them. Being a ministry kid is genuinely really isolating at times. There's not many of your peers at school who understand what it's like to be on show, especially in a small town. And your life, though you might think it's private, is actually public in lots of ways. So when we arrive in Moruya, our families has a photo taken and we're second page in the newspaper. So before I arrive into my primary school, people know who I am. They know my faith background, which then follows me as a fairly small human being, really. And so the people who understand that best are other ministers' kids. And so Ministers' Family Camp was a really great time to be able to connect with them and be able to share our experiences in a way that I couldn't share them with other kids, even other kids in church, because it's a bit different to that as well. And Ministers' Family Camps for me are particularly fond because that's where I became a Christian. So I had grown up in a Christian household. I had been to church my whole life. I'd been through Bible college as a kid with a dad at Bible college. I did lots of jobs around the place, but I wasn't actually a Christian. I was just relying on the fact that we were a Christian, that my family did lots of stuff at church, and that saved me. So it wasn't until someone who pointed out to us as ministers' kids that actually it didn't matter what you do at church or who your family are or what your dad does. It's actually about you, and you need to trust in Jesus to be saved. So I found that very important. Some things that my parents did outside of that. So we did parent-child dates, so daddy-daughter dates, mummy-daughter dates, and mummy-son dates, and daddy-son dates, however it works out with the four of us, where we would go and spend some time with one of our parents, just one-on-one. We would go and get a special treat, and we'd just be able to chat about life. And I think that was a really nice way of connecting with them. And then that kind of culminated in when we finished year 12, we each went on a trip with a parent for a few weeks after that time. And I think that was just a really nice way to finish off schooling, but also formally finish off kind of that time of living at home as we left and went to uni and did our different things, and just really helped solidify relationships. The other thing that caught me off guard being a minister's kid was the transition to not being a minister's kid. So I grew up where my parents and their theology was the main theology that I knew. And all of a sudden I left home and I went to a church where people didn't necessarily think the same way on everything as what my family had. And so that was really interesting to think through. I think it felt strange for a long time, no longer being on the inside of church. I moved to the outside where I didn't know behind the scenes things anymore. And so learning to live with decisions without being able to say, hey, Dad, why did you do such and such? Why did this happen? Why, like X, Y, and Z. And so being able to live with decisions without knowing why decisions were made was a transition as well. And so it took some time. And I had to work really hard at not comparing my dad to the minister where I was. I try and catch ministers' kids now before they leave home. There's a big thing where when you're the minister's kid, we see dad when he's tired and he's grumpy and he's had a bad day, and we get to see behind the curtain that's not the man up the front giving the sermon. And sometimes, and that's a sinful, fallen human being. And so when you move to a new church and all you see is the game face of the person up the front. You say to yourself on the inside, but hey, my dad isn't like that. And it wasn't until our minister in Albury actually mentioned one day in his sermon that he was grumpy that I actually put together that actually he was exactly the same as my dad. I just didn't see it because he wasn't my dad. And so just that transition from actually, I don't know this person in the same way that I know my dad, and that's okay. And I need to work hard at not comparing that person to my dad. And now I have to work even harder because I can't compare my dad to my husband, to the minister at the church that I'm at, because each minister has their own unique skills and gifts and talents and weaknesses. And so to line them all up is just unfair to everyone. So I had to work hard at not comparing. The other thing that I found really interesting was, as a minister's kid, I'd grown accustomed to doing a lot of different jobs at church, sometimes because there was no one else to do them, and other times because we were there already, so it just kind of made sense. And so when I moved to a new church, I was told I wasn't allowed to do any jobs for a term, which might seem a bit strange, but it was actually really helpful in allowing me to think through, well, why am I actually doing these things at church in the first place? Because I'd grown so accustomed to just doing things because I saw a need, feel a need, like the kids' robot movie. And so being able to actually just stop and say, actually, what is my heart doing? Why am I serving in this way? And thinking through how I could love the congregation where I was with the gifts that God had given me. That's a little bit of my childhood. Yeah. Did that make sense, Mum?
Yeah, it made sense. I actually remember that moment where you said something like that you'd seen behind the curtain of the minister of a different minister, and I didn't know exactly what you'd seen, but you acknowledged that had been something that you realised. I remember when that happened years ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah, very helpful, because there is a thing as people in ministry where you do put on a game face, and obviously you can't keep that game face on for the whole of your life, and it's the people in your house that see what's left over after a Sunday, after a particularly difficult interaction with someone, those kind of things. So yeah, I think that's really helpful to say that, well, for all of us, we know men in ministry, and we keep meeting other men in ministry, and it's helpful not to be too judgmental and comparative when we're looking at people. Basically, everyone needs compassion, and it's really it's lovely, Bec, that you have the maturity to see your parents as people, because that does take a bit of growing up to get to that point where you can, not just be reacting, but actually be reflective about people.
So I've got some questions for Mum.
Yes.
Because, as you all know, I get to be a ministry wife as of next year, which is, let's just put it out on the forefront, is not something that I sought out at all. After being a ministry kid, I married a plasterer who finished school in year 10, and I thought I was on a smooth wicket.
And I married a welfare worker who became a rehab counsellor. So neither of us married men who were already set up to be ministers.
Yeah. And so I have lots to learn from my mum, which is I recognise as a really unique position to be in, and not many ministry wives go into ministry being able to call up their mum and say, hey, Mum, this has happened. So we will share our conversation with you so that you also can learn from the wisdom of my mum. So
no pressure.
No pressure. So over the years, because I've been a minister's kid, I've met lots of different ministers' wives and had lots of conversations with ministry wives. And each one I talk to has a different answer to different questions. And so what has been your experience with making friends in the church that you are a part of?
Yeah, so I too have heard a number of different answers to this kind of question. So my first response to that is I think different people think of friends in different ways, as in the word friend. What is a friend? Who is a friend? And that type of thing. And I think it is very personality based, what we consider to be a friend, who we consider to be a friend. So one of the things that I'm really grateful to God for my time in Maria was that when we started out there was no one in the church within decades of my age and stage. And so that caused me to actually seek friends outside of the church in a way that I wouldn't have needed to if I had gone to a different church where there was full on family programs with lots of other families. I just would have my life would have revolved around interacting with those people and not ever needed to go outside of that. So I did have genuine friendships with people who were not part of the church and who weren't Christians in Maria. So I think that's actually, I think that having friends outside of a church is very possible. I also think that it's good and helpful to have friends who are elsewhere than where you live, who have similar ministry experiences or who have known you for a long time. So those kind of friends who are sort of half friend, half family, really, because they've been a big part of your life for so long. You hold on to them like anything, and you just, even if it's been years since you've actually seen each other, you still hold on to those relationships. I think this is one of the tricky things about ministry wifing is the friend relationships inside a church. So I think that it's risky to have close friendships inside a church, though I know some people would say that they can manage that. I don't know that I would feel that was it wasn't possible in some places, and it wasn't easy, but also I wasn't necessarily needing that. I needed friends, but I didn't necessarily need to have a friend for my own purposes inside a church. But I'm going to say that in the context also that in churches, you expect to have people in your Bible study group or other smaller groups where there is a bit of a deeper level of sharing, where it's a bit like being a work colleague. It's a bit like being, people who are doing life together. There's still a level, though, that it's difficult, if not unhelpful, to talk about husband-related things that will impact on ministry. So some things are very straightforward to talk about, like illnesses in the family, health problems, I think would be fairly straightforward thing. But that your husband is really stressed or really or isn't sleeping or something like that, that is where I think it is much trickier to be open, to be as open as you might be with a friend who's outside the church, or who lives elsewhere, or a family member. So it's very contextual. I think it depends on who you are, who he is, what the state of the ministry is, what you might say to other people inside the church. And I know that other people will have other opinions about that, but that's what I think. And for any of the student wives there, if you wanted to talk about that some more, that would be fine. Either let Bec know or even put something in the chat, and we might have time later to have a look at some of those things. Rebecca, is that enough on that, or would you like me to talk?
Yeah. If any questions come up, feel free to put them in the chat, and then I will moderate from the chat, and I can ask Mum some questions from there. And that way you won't need to hold them until the end. We can integrate them in as we go. So there's, again, different people, different experiences I've talked to. with couples, and they share different amounts of information about meetings and pastoral matters and people in the church between the husband and the minister and his wife. How did that look for you and Dad?
Yeah, so I was trying to remember. It is tricky, and this is where some of the ambiguity comes in, I think, about working out, because you have a husband who is your husband, who you might talk to about things. Your husband also has a job, which is the minister, and you want to support him in that. But it's not like a business meeting or a ministry team meeting where the rules might be clearer about what can be said or not can be said. So there's some general rules that I'll talk about. And I might also give you an exception to a rule that happened once to try to flesh it out a bit.
Mm.
So there's information, people have information that is their own personal information that doesn't need to go to anyone else unless there's a reason. So if someone tells me something that's about them, to start with, it's their information and they can choose to share that or not to share that. If someone was telling me something that was really significant that I thought would be helpful for Dad to know, I would suggest that they might like to talk to him about that. Or I might actually say to them, do you mind if I let him know that this is going on? Like, I would seek permission for someone else's information to be shared. And I know that you know, Bec, that there are notifiable things. So people in churches can sometimes actually tell you about DV or about children's welfare, and that level of issue isn't a choice about what you do with it. It actually needs to go through the proper channels, which is usually the minister. It can be someone else at church, but it's usually the minister, and it needs to be dealt with properly. So it doesn't matter if someone asks you not to tell. If it's actually a notifiable thing, it has to be dealt with for legal reasons and for safety reasons. But at a lower level, like at a much lower level, if people are wanting to give him information, like if they wanted to talk to me about something in the hope that I would then pass it on to him, I would make it clear that I wasn't the conduit of messages to go to him. And that's also why I would try to get them to tell him themselves. I would say, oh, well, he'll be home this afternoon. If you want to give him a ring after 3, or you can send him an email and he'll get back to you during the week or something like that. Like, I would try to get that, get them to do it themselves. So I'm going to give you an exception to that, which happened once, where Dad had a really stressful time pastorally. So he'd had an elder die and an elder's wife die within a few weeks of each other. They were both sudden deaths, and we hadn't been there that long. So there was a lot going on. And someone actually rang. I can't remember if I answered Dad's phone so he didn't need to, or whether they actually rang me directly, but they needed him to know that there was a pregnancy that shouldn't have been. And so it was time that he was told that, but they didn't want to directly have to put another pressure on him. So that was the one exception where I said, that's all right, I will tell him and he will talk to you about it later. So what it did was give Dad a chance to not have to have his game face on, to face yet another thing, but then he could do it himself. But the general rule is that you don't get in the middle of people communicating if you can help it. Yeah. It's a bit trickier, a bit less clear, I think, with all the ins and outs of business stuff going on at church and so on. So like things that I might be thinking I might share with Dad, but not necessarily what other people have told me. So yeah, it's not straightforward. It can be straightforward and it can be ambiguous, and it's one of those wisdom things, I think, which is why I told you the exception, because the rule is helpful, but the exception helps to explain why you would normally do it the other way.
Because you wouldn't normally have answered Dad's phone.
No.
Would you?
No.
Yeah.
So I can't actually remember if I remember being in the office when I took the phone call. So I'm wondering whether I actually, picked it up for him, or whether they actually rang me directly on my phone and I happened to be in the office. Don't know. Yeah, so there's basic principles underneath the information sharing thing. So there's a safety principle that you want to keep ministry as safe as possible, and you want to keep churches as safe as possible. So I'd say safety trumps confidentiality, but confidentiality is really important. And you would only break someone's confidentiality about their own personal information if you had to, but you would try not to do that. There would have to be a good reason, and that kind of good reason would be a safety reason.
Yeah, very helpful. There's a few of us that I know of that are moving into Manses next year, and some of us are moving into on-site Manses, which we know you have lots of experience with, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I think even yesterday I was speaking to someone in Albury, and they're like, "Oh, how convenient that you're in an on-site Manse, because then it's not very far from the church." And I said, only someone will never live in an on-site Manse would say that. They are a blessing, and it's great to be provided with a house. But how does living in an on-site? You've done both. How did ministry look different living in an on-site Manse than maybe living in an off-site Manse?
Yeah, so the on-site Manse was definitely publicly known as being the place where people might turn up anytime for asking for anything. So just like anywhere else I've lived, I tend to have the wire door locked. So even if I've got the wooden door open, I wouldn't ever leave a front door unlocked. I don't think that matters if you're in a Manse on site or not, unless you've got kids out the front. You keep a level of safety there. It was tricky. So it would be tricky to have people turn up and then to have to make some kind of assessment about what to do. So generally, no money. So generally, I would not give money. I remember the day that someone yelled at me because I wouldn't give him the money that he was asking for. It was actually helpful that day in my befuddled answering the door and having someone demand money, that I actually didn't have that amount of money in my purse, because I literally started thinking, have I got $3.50 or whatever and I didn't. So that was helpful, just to give me that pause to respond. But basically, you don't give money at the door. Sometimes ministers' fraternals will make other rules, like that no ministers in town will be refueling people's cars, or whatever they decide is the way that they want to manage some of the demands on them. It is really helpful to find out what your local support systems are. Often the Salvation Army will have emergency provisions if you've got a Salvation Army, or some other kind of church system or welfare system might already have things in place. So if you're going somewhere, then it's helpful to find out fairly soon what the deal is in that town and who you might be able to find out from. We have given people food at the door, and then found the food scattered along the street. But, some people actually genuinely need food. And we were having a chat the other day about the lady that used to turn up, every 6 months asking for nappies. And Dad would actually go with her to the supermarket, buy the nappies, and give her the nappies to take. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say about that is that, and I don't know that I always did it, but the more that I've thought about it, is that it's really helpful to speak kindly to people. So no matter what their demand is at the door, or their request, if they're being particularly polite, it doesn't cost you anything to be kind and compassionate to them about whatever they're saying their dilemma is or their disaster is, where they're looking for help. it doesn't mean that you have to actually meet those needs, but you can sympathise with a person, genuinely sympathise with a person, even if you're not sure why they might have run out of money or what their, how justified their disaster might be. It is easier when your husband is home, but when you live in a non-site manse, there will be times where he's just not there when someone comes to the door for all different kinds of reasons. They might come for all different kinds of things. So my approach would be, you keep the door locked, you don't give out money. You consider other options when they ask for things, whatever, and you find out what else is available in town, because you can be fairly sure that people who struggle are going to test out systems to see what they can get and from whom. So it is helpful to have some idea yourself, and even to be in contact with, the other ministers' wives in the area, the other welfare agencies in the area, and know where people can get help, or where you can suggest they try. So that, like that minister's fraternal in Maria actually had the policy about fuel, because there'd been that many ministers hit up for filling tanks with fuel that they realised it was a bit of a thing. So it was helpful that they then had worked out a common response to that. It stopped people going around from one place to the other to get what they wanted.
And with that house, when we lived on site, did you and Dad ever have time off at home? Or was home work?
Yeah. So Fridays were very clearly our day off, and when you guys went to school, we would be gone for those 6 hours. At the time, we were tired, and we pulled up at a lookout somewhere and just went to sleep in the car. And every time I half woke up, there was a different car that had pulled up next to us with different people, and then they'd driven off again, and we were dozing in the car. And I'm thinking, why didn't those people knock on the window and make sure we weren't unconscious or something? But they didn't. They just let us sleep at the lookout. Yeah, so that was one of the things. So thankfully, in Maria, it was easy to get to very nice places within half an hour. So we would go off somewhere, go to the movies,
sleep at lookouts,
out of town, go to a lookout, fall asleep because, we were being pathetically tired, that type of thing, but away from the house. Do we ever go out on Friday nights as well? Did we take you guys out, or did we just stay home once?
I think we were normally home.
Yeah. So that was quite different than when we lived in Tamworth in our own house, because when we had a day off, we could be home renovating. We didn't have to, but that was also helpful because Tamworth didn't have easy, nice places to get to within half an hour of where we lived. Like, it was a bit more on its own. Whereas you get up.
I do remember the first family holiday we had. We could go. We went home, but we were still on holidays. It was the first in Tamworth.
In Tamworth?
No, in Tamworth. For one of the first times, because as a kid, every family holiday we would uproot and we would go away, and it's just exhausting to be away on holidays all the time. You're just in new places doing different things. So I vividly remember all of a sudden we had a week of family holiday at home, and it was amazing because we got to sleep in our own beds and not have to pack anything.
We were probably renovating something at the time.
Probably, so probably ripping up carpet or putting in a sump pit.
Yeah. That's the kind of thing we did for fun.
Yeah. So while just those of us at college, college can feel like an all-consuming beast that's overwhelming, where you just tread water for 4 years. Does it get better?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought getting out into ministry was so much easier than being a student's wife. So yes, if you're heading out soon, or you're heading out in the next couple of years, it will. Well, I think it should feel better. I think it should, for a number of reasons. One of them is that you actually have the opportunity to settle in. So it's to settle into a place where you're going to live for a while at least. and to settle into a church. So you're not just there for a year and it's sort of as an adjunct to someone else's student role. You're actually going to be settled into a place. And you have an opportunity to connect to the community in a different way than when you're a temporary student or student wife. What I wanted to say about that was that the dislocation and the distress at times of being a student wife, I think that you can harness that when you go out into ministry, because you have experienced being an outsider to a system. So your husband got allocated to a church for a year or 2 years or whatever, and you were sort of landed in there. It wasn't your church. It wasn't going to be long term. Sometimes, like if you've got kids, you've spent a lot of time juggling kids like I did, so he could study, so he could be the student at a church. And so when you go out into a church, and you did that as a person who was familiar with churches. So you're, as a student wife, you're a Christian, you've been to church for many years, and now you've actually experienced being on the edges and being an outsider to a system. So when you go to a church where your husband is the minister, you become a system insider, but you do that keeping an eye on the people who are on the periphery. So someone who's visiting, who's not going to be there long term, you actually take notice of them and invite them in. The people who are not system insiders, you know what that feels like. You can be particularly compassionate and mindful of finding them and seeing them and including them in things, even explaining how things work, so that they can settle in or they can be part of things as long as you've got them there. I think ministry wifing was easier too, because there's better financial status, so you can afford to buy things. Whereas as a student's wife, we bought
no
one
more
thing
mince and sausages.
Yeah. So my children still struggle with the cheap sausages and so on, because that's what we lived on for so long. And so, so although pastoral ministry isn't a huge wage, it's certainly a very livable one, and you've got options of whether your kids might do piano lessons or you can see the physio, all those things that you would have really not been able to do or really had to prioritise to get them in. You can actually fit more of those things into a budget. Yeah, so the financial pressure is easier. You are going to be inside the system of a church in a kind of odd, ambiguous role, but you actually are part of things. And you do find out some of the things that are going on. So as a child, Bec, I don't know that you knew everything that was going on, but you certainly knew some of the things that are a bit hard to hide when stuff actually happens in your house because of people coming and going. Yeah. Is that enough on that one, or do you want any more?
Nope, that's good. I'm just going to jump back before we get to the last couple of questions, because we've got two ones that have come through. So Kat, who's a student wife, wanted to know about relationships between elders' wives and ministers' wives. She's had some helpful ones. What's been your experience with that kind of relationship?
There's definitely the potential with some elders' wives who are particularly ministry minded and are supportive, but churches and elderships and the wives of elders are a very mixed bunch. So it's possible that there could be someone or several people, and it's certainly possible that there can be a level of ownership of ministry stuff that's that can be sort of collegial, but not necessarily. So not like elders vary, their wives vary even more, I think, about who. So, yeah, I would say some elders' wives more helpful than others. Yeah,
Yep.
but you have to test out relationships.
Yeah.
The good thing about not being a student wife anymore is that you've got a bit more time, so you don't have to have solved every relationship in the first few weeks. You just
Not on day one.
not on day one, no.
I would like to know what happened with the fence problem in Maruya. Apparently, it's a Nance thing that fences and Nances are an odd bunch. What happened with the fence?
So the week that we moved to Maruya, they had helpfully extended the manse. So the manse was now up to standard, but they hadn't quite done the back fence. So the Saturday night, the golf club across the corner had a major concert, and there was a riot in our backyard around our clothesline because people had spilled
Police
out
lights
of the
flashing through the house.
Yeah, this is where I poke your dad because he is sleeping as the red and white police lights are going around our bedroom because the people are like literally within a couple of meters of our back, the back of the house, because they're around the clothesline having their little riot because they've come out excited or whatever.
Someone won the football or something.
Yeah. I think it was the Screaming Jets he talks about, but I don't remember the name of the band. So I made that story known to various people, and one of the very kind elders helped Dad to put the rest of the fence up fairly quickly. So
have a riot, I think, is the answer.
Yeah, have a bit of a riot or some other thing where you point it out, so that people can fix it. Apparently, putting up fences isn't that complicated. It's a fairly straightforward thing to do as long as the funds are released for it. But that was the kind of thing that wasn't an official request from me through Committee of Management. That was me just being expressive about what had happened to us on Saturday night. Yeah.
You could officially ask, though.
So as a regular member of a congregation, you see something and you think this needs changing or that needs some money or, that's a priority. You would talk to Committee of Management and see what they can do. It's much more complicated as a ministry wife. You can't suggest that the minister gets more money. You can't suggest that the minister's family gets a new carpet. But you can not be circumspect if there's actually an opportunity to say something in general. So that's what I think about that. So I know that's the tricky thing for those of us who like to get things sorted out and are fairly straightforward with the way that we think about things, is that we're in a system where there is some vulnerability for the ministry wife because she's not the official employee, but her whole life revolves around what the church has set up for her husband and how the church is treating her husband and what his workload is like and that kind of thing. So it's hard. That's one of the hard things that that ministry wives need to deal with. Yeah,
it's really helpful.
Is that
insight.
helpful?
Well, it's not reassuring, but it's helpful.
It's the reality, I think.
Yeah. Which I think is the same as the reality that I saw. In that it's not all bright shiny gold. There are good bits, but there are also bits that are really hard and tricky and nuanced and need wisdom and time to learn those things as well. So reflecting back, is there something that you think helped you set up a sustainable ministry family? Or is there maybe something that you would have avoided with hindsight?
Yeah, so I thought about that question and I was thinking it's a question about avoiding pain, isn't it?
Which we all like to do.
Because I like to be as comfortable as possible. So if someone gave me a rule of thumb, I would try that. And it's reasonable on one hand to try to avoid problems. But what we know is that there will be pain, because life is painful, even as a Christian. And as a Christian in ministry, it's a different kind of, there's different kinds of options for pain that other people in the congregation don't necessarily have. They might have other things that are really painful for them, but ministry wifing has its own set of potential pain as you go about it. Some things I think that are really vital are normal self-care strategies. So we were very big on a day off, like a proper day off that started the day before, that we did every week, so that in those weeks where things went ballistic, they were very much the exception, and we already had some capacity built into the system. Because if you're redlining it all the time and then more stuff happens, then you don't naturally have the energy to deal with it. Whereas if you have taken, the usual things, like you've tried to exercise, you've tried to eat, you've tried to sleep, you're resting when that's appropriate, then it actually gives you more capacity for the times where things just can't happen. I don't know if it was a mistake or not. This was one of the things that I just made a decision on at the time, and I don't know. So when we moved into Maria, because the congregation was so much older than us, I asked my parents not to come to help us settle in, which is why Jan and Bruce took you that day that we were moving in, because we had all these kids and all this stuff arriving, and then 3 random
It would have been a pre-fence riot.
Yeah. There was 3 different random people from the community who decided that was the day that they would come and see us, because we were moving in that day. So the reason why I had asked my parents not to come, even though they were happy to do that, was that they were a generation older than us, much closer to the age of the congregations that we were going to have. And so I thought that it might set up the dynamic of them finding more common ground with my parents than with us, and we wanted to arrive as a unit, and for them to deal with us, not to see us through the eyes of our parents. I don't know if that was a good decision or not, but it was one that I made. I got to understand my own response to things over the years. So I discovered, and it was particularly clear when we moved to Maria, that my psychological response was to go high energy, gung-ho in. It's like I learnt everybody's name in an instant. I learnt facts about their kids and, all that kind of thing. Like, it was just, my brain was on fire. And of course I crashed a few weeks later, as in there was this initial energy, and then felt more of the pain of the transition and so on a few weeks down the track. So it's helpful. It was helpful for me to realize that that's a pattern for me, because I do that wherever I go. Whenever I go into a new system, I have that, but I don't crash as hard anymore, because I know that's what's going to happen. So I say, my brain's going my brain's going hot, working out, trying to work out all these people and all this system and so on. But I need to take a deep breath.
Yeah.
So another thing about sustainability is that to encourage support, ministers must have supervision and mentoring if they can, have all those regular professional supports in place, because you can't, as a wife, you can't be the main, or you can't be that type of support. You don't have the perspective, you don't have the distance to be able to help in that way. So ministers need to do those kind of things, but it's also helpful for wives to have a mechanism for reflective practice. So we do what's in front of us, we get through the day, we get through the week, we take care of our kids, we take care of the house and what we can help with at church and all of that type of thing. But from time to time, it's helpful to have those moments where you actually stop and look at it as a whole rather than just the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So spiritual renewal groups are helpful for that. It's not the only way to do things, but it's one of the helpful things that's out there for ministry wives. It's also helpful because you're dealing directly with people who have similar priorities in life, I guess. Yeah, similar financial expectations, similar ways of, working out what's important and what's not so important. You won't all be, you'll be different, but, there's a bit more common ground.
Shared perspective.
Shared perspective on things.
Like the kids at Minister's Family Camp.
Exactly like that. Yeah. So that Minister's Family Camp is now Refresh, I think.
Yes, Refresh. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I particularly think things like that are really helpful for ministry wives, even more so than the husbands, because the wives have less opportunity to mix and to be with their whole family at an event where people are able to talk to each other and do a bit of relaxing. Sylvia's just put up, next Refresh is April. Yes.
2025.
Not next year, 2025. So put it in your calendars now, make it a priority.
Yeah.
And I have learnt over the years, so you were asking about mistakes and so on. I have learnt over the years to be quicker to step forward into difficulties. So my normal approach would have been to avoid things if I thought things were getting a bit tense with someone. So I'm getting better at going forward, stepping forward, and getting better at doing things face-to-face or on the phone, rather than my natural tendency would have been to write it down, so to put it in an email or a text. Whereas I think I don't think they're helpful if there's any difficulty. So written communication is great when everyone is just sorting out business type things. But as soon as there's any emotion involved, it's got to be face-to-face. And if it can't be face-to-face, then it's got to be phone. Yeah, so that things can be all those other aspects of communication apart from the words can be communicated.
Yeah, because things can get lost when they're written down, meaning and tone.
Yeah.
We were chatting the other week about something that you'd done in Bible study recently about the unhelpful lies that we tell ourselves. And it was really helpful, and I think it will be helpful for lots of different people. And I was just wondering if you could share some of that with us.
Yeah, so I was thinking about some of the lies that ministry wives might hear, and it's basically it comes from the evil one. So it comes, they're the whispers that you can then pick up and repeat to yourself over and over again, which is particularly unhelpful. Things like, this is too hard, no one understands, why can't I do whatever like everyone else can do or like anyone else might expect. There's also that aspect of my life is not important. What's important is my husband's ministry, and my own life is just sort of an adjunct to his. So some of these, all good most good lies have an aspect of them that's potentially true. It's valid, but it's the thrust of the thing that's unhelpful. There is a temptation. So because this is tough, I can indulge in a little bit of whatever. So, whether that's escapism, whether that's alcohol, whether that's any other way that people make themselves feel better when things are rough. There's also the temptation to think that I need to make sure that the church or the ministry or that person in my church is okay. It's all up to me. Like, I am the backstop. I am the person. So there's an aspect of that that's actually true, in that sometimes we are helpful in a situation, like that we are the person who might need to be a link in the chain. But it's unhelpful to hear that for that lie that you need to be that person, that there is no one else. A lie like my suffering is meaningless. No one can see, no one understands what that's like. So I think with any of those lies that come from the father of lies, that what we need to do if we hear them is to actually stop and look at them. So don't let them play on a loop. What you do is you actually say, that's a thought that I've had. Let's have a look at that thought. Like, let's have a look at it, turn and face it. And then you've actually got a chance to bring it in light of scripture, of actually saying it to someone who's helpful for you, so that they can help you challenge it, or to consider it, or to consider which aspect of it is true, which aspect of it is just wrong, so that it doesn't become something that taints your walk with Christ, that taints your relationships with other people. Yeah, so that was the kind of thing I was thinking about.
I think that's really helpful to go back and fact check, which also works really well for anxiety. For anxious thoughts, you catch them, and then you weigh them, and you weigh them against fact and reality, and you think to yourself, well, what happened? What would someone else think if I told them this? So if you don't have that physical person there, you can think, well, what would my husband think if I said this out loud? And the chances are they would tell you something different than what you thought yourself.
Yes, because he may not be the person to say one of those things to at every time. That could be more helpful to say it, to test it out with someone else. Depends what state he's in and what he's up to. And husbands are great and can be told a lot of different things, but that doesn't mean that they are the person for everything that could be said.
Absolutely. And so I guess to finish off our questions with you, were there some biblical truths or encouragements that you had?
Yeah, so because Bec and I have been thinking about this for a little while, sometimes things would pop up. So there was the time I was listening to a sermon in Albury on John 21, and this wasn't at all the point of the sermon, but what I noticed about that passage, so this is a passage after Jesus has appeared to the disciples, and he's appeared to them a number of times, and their disciples decide to go out fishing for the day. So you can just imagine they're trying to regulate themselves after all the craziness of what's been going on, all the emotion and so on. And so they go out fishing, and early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" No, they answered. So he tells them to throw it out on the other side. When they bring their fish back, this is what I noticed. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So what I think is remarkable about that is that servant-heartedness of Jesus, to have been there early in the morning to create the fire, to get the coals, and to have the fish ready for the disciples who were out doing it. As an analogy of what it can be like to be the backup crew for a minister, and to have done things that look pretty unglamorous, but have been thoughtful and thought through and are helpful. And then Jesus goes on to actually deal with some real stuff with Peter and the other disciples. But, it's great that even as the Lord of the universe, that he's actually got up and made the fire so that it's ready for them. And I just wanted to balance that with that Mary and Martha passage where, and I always forget which one it is, whether it's Mary or Martha, he gets all uptight because it's in Mark. Oh, no, Luke 10. Sorry, let's look it up. Because this is where I think we can get caught up. So this is from Luke 10. So Jesus and his disciples were on their way. They came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and said, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you're worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. So I get the Martha stuff, because sometimes you can see the stuff that needs to be done, and you can be doing the stuff that needs to be done. And it can create its own whirlwind of being the background that other people should be helping with. Whereas it's actually just because it's jobs that so her intention in doing the jobs was to keep her house open, which was a good thing. And she made sure that there was food and that the things were cleaned and all that kind of thing. But in this case, it had become a problem that she was getting wound up about that when her sister was actually ready to listen to Jesus. Does that help?
So I think sometimes we become the support team and we're just the pit crew, but actually we need to stop being the pit crew and actually listen.
Oh, well, yep. And that there's nothing wrong with being the unglamorous pit crew either.
Pit crew, no. But you need to do both.
Yeah. It's like anything in life, the motivations can shift and change, and we can be starting off doing something well and thoughtfully, but it can become a burden. It can become something that causes resentment or whatever. So it's helpful to keep, that's how reflective practice can be useful in giving you pause to actually think through and pray through things as a whole, rather than just getting caught up. Yeah. So Jesus had set up that support thing in a way that was good and helpful. Martha had set it up, and then it had degenerated into something that where she was caught up in the wrong thing. We as humans do that. Yeah. One more from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. I just find this helpful. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. That kind of idea that we are frail, we are human, we need rest, we need food, we need encouragement, we need things just to function as human beings. But the treasure is from God and not from us. And it is helpful that this is not something that you do on your own, that you do it each day, asking for the sufficient grace that you need for that context, that day, that stuff going on in the family, that stuff going on in the church, that stuff going on at work, that he provides the resources already for what we need, or he provides extra. And it's all to reflect his glory. So us being jars of clay actually does reflect that the glory is not ours, but his.
That's really helpful. That's all the questions that I had. We thought we'd finish with something that I've been working on. So yes. Being a minister's kid, going into the role of the minister's wife, I'm really passionate at making sure that I set my kids up as well as I can. So I've been working on writing them a picture book. It does not have pictures yet because I am not arty. But I've written down some words. And so I guess some of this is a reflection of the things that I found difficult as a child that I want to be explicit at saying to my children. And also just an encouragement to them that sometimes life feels different as a minister's kid, but that's actually okay. So let me read you what I've got so far. It is a work in progress. It will not take me long. My dad has lots of different names: Len, pastor, minister, reverend, but I get to call him Dad. My dad is a minister in a church. He teaches people about God and helps them to follow Jesus. Sometimes my dad is busy doing work and taking care of other people. Other times my dad is not as busy and he has more time to play with me. Other people might think I need to look or behave a certain way because my dad is a minister. But I am a normal kid and I'm still learning, and that is okay. If I'm enjoying church, that's great. If I'm finding church hard, that is also okay, and I can always talk to mum or dad about it. Church can be hard for adults as well. Just because my dad is the minister and my family do a lot at church does not make me friends with God. I need to trust in Jesus for myself to be a part of God's family. My dad has lots of different names, but I love that I get to call him Dad. That's where we're at. It'll get pictures at some point.
So I just wanted to thank you, Cherryn and Bec, for sharing your stories with us. I had a lot of questions as well, selfishly for Bec, because I have kids in ministry, and but that's okay. We can talk about that later. If you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to send them through. But I'm conscious that it's 5 to 9, and we said close at 9. So you can always send an email back to where you registered, and I can talk to Bec and Cherryn and see where we go from there. I'm going to pray. Thank God for Cherryn and Bec, and pray for us all as we head off for the night. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your love for us and for the words that you've given Cherryn and Bec to share with us tonight. Lord, we pray that you will give us a sufficient grace for each day in our homes, in our families, in our churches, that you will provide the resources we need, not so that we feel good about the ministry we're doing, but for the unity of your church and most importantly, for your glory. We ask that as we move on from here and we go back to our families or our partners, our husbands, or whatever it is that is happening for us next, that the words of hope that you have given us tonight will be with us, but especially that picture of our Lord who gets the wood and lights the fire so that we have a place to be with him. The Lord who sees us and cares for us and knows us, even in those hardest challenges in ministry. Amen. You can. Okay, excellent. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.